Hello everyone, my name is Elian Marquez and I have created a slideshow of native people from California. These are some indigenous tribes native to California. Many inhabited the region of California, Baja California, and Mexico, and in Mexico in the mountains. Some tribes in these regions include Pomo, Tolowa, Nisenan, Lasik, Yuruk, Washo, Yuki, Hopa, and among many more. Those are just some of them. The community that has a lot of movement lately has been the Kumeyaay at Los Angeles. The region these groups inhabited in California, well, they inhabited parts from the Pacific Ocean to the mountains. During the winter, these tribes would travel between 135 miles, and some traveled to Mexico, other traveled to the US, or stayed in the US. At this time, there weren't really boundaries, so they would travel to where they had previously traveled and where they knew they could find food again. So like I said, during the winter, these tribes would go down to the desert and they would live off of mesquite beans, prickly pears, among many more. And during the early spring and summer, they would come down to the mountains and to the Pacific Ocean. They would also hunt, fish, and gather many more seafood. And these are some just of the regions. So they would travel from anywhere between here to the Pacific Ocean and back and forth. It depended heavily on the season they were facing. These are their migration routes. They also depended heavily on the seasons, and they would travel around 135 plus miles, and they would have to travel between a few weeks, so it took them a bit of time to get to their destination back then. And as you can see, there's actually an interstate now going right past them, and there's actually some reservation camps around here. Origins. The origins I researched, and like I previously heard in one of the videos, it said that they came down from Asia when when the climate was different, and that happened between 15 to 12,000 years ago. And the oldest piece of evidence ever recorded in California is 10,000 years old. So there's also the possibility that they might have come in canoes or small boats. Well, not boats, well, canoes. Their diet. This is what their diet consisted of. Well, like I said, for the Kumeyaay, their diet consisted of mesquite beans and whatever the desert could provide them. They could find prickly pears, and the Kumeyaay also planted trees in the fields. They planted squash, beans, corn, and they also knew a lot about herbs and the use as herbal medicine. And they would also gather fruits, berries, peanuts, acorns, and they used these for their traditional food. It is also important to know that they were also the ones who planted acorns and nuts all around California. They knew that these nuts were really important to them, so they knew that not every year the tree would fruit, so meaning that not every year the tree would give acorns or nuts. So they had to rely on different foods, but they also tried to have some control over the amount of acorns and nuts they could harvest. They also grew corn, squash, and they ate fish, large game like deer. Other animals like rabbit were also important to them and to other tribes around California. Their traditions are a lot similar to other communities around them, and they dance the bird songs, and it's usually someone important, figure in their community, a leader. Some sacred lands were shared in their creation stories, and religious rituals are tied to specific areas of the land and places, and they are considered holy. Yeah, and you can see there's a lady right there who is dancing to bird songs. These are some of the tools that were useful to the tribes around California. The indigenous, to hunt, the indigenous people often used arrows and bows and arrows, and they used different materials to make them. Leaves of the agave. So they also cook the heart of the agave and eat it as a traditional food. But the agave leaf can't be eaten; it's too bitter. So they could use that to make baskets, nets, hooks, many more items. And whenever they would harvest nuts or acorns, they would use this machine, well, not a machine, this equipment to grind them into flour. And then they would, after the acorns were flour, they would wash it so the toxins could be removed. And yeah, you could see they did a lot of grinding, and they would utilize another rock to grind. And these places were often very close to the place where they harvested acorns, so you could find these around in California. These are some of the languages most common to this region. The most common languages from this region are Yuman languages, and they extend all the way to Baja California and Southern California and some parts of Arizona. And the reason that it's the most common language is because they evolved from Yuman languages, and these are just other languages common to this area. So before the native pre-contact and the contact, before the Native Americans had contact, they had communities consisting anywhere between 50 to 500 people, and that was because they could easily access food, and they could keep their communities that big. But during the mid 17th century, people started to have contact with Native Americans, the settlers, and they often brought diseases, and they raided their communities, they raped their women, and many more horrid events like this, many mass murders. And under Spanish rule, most women were beat to prevent them from getting pregnant. So if a woman was pregnant, they would beat her, or they would basically have her become sterile through these punishments. And yes, what was it like for them when the settlers arrived for their land? Well, at first the Native Americans were very welcoming. They offered food, and they took care of their stock, and They were very helpful overall. But soon after, the settlers started to hold them captive, started converting them to slaves, and they malnourished them so they wouldn't um, break out. They were very horrible towards the Native Americans. They also developed missionaries in the 18th century to control them. And this is there. The Catholic missions began in the 17th century, ending around mid 18th century. The missionaries were basically trying to convert the Native Americans to become Catholic. They were 21 missions in total, and they had converted. Their mission was to convert as many Christians as they could, but through their conversions, many children were lost. They would beat them. They would quote unquote, quote, take the Indian out of them. So they didn't necessarily want to make them Catholic. They wanted to control them and control their thinking. Uh, the Native American communities were terrorized from vicious groups like the Catholic missions, but also the 49ers. That in one of previous presentation from Dr. Maestas mentions that the miners had no problem killing the Native Americans. They wanted to gain power over them. They kidnapped them. They sold them, and they killed the remaining family. And they would sell them to missionaries, churches, people who wanted a slave, and it was for greed. People wanted to get the gold, silver. They wanted to have control over those areas that they knew they could find gold. That's why they called the 49ers. And that is my works cited. Thank you very much for listening to my short presentation.